I have two kind of sections of the presentation. The first is about syllabus and course structure. So we're early enough in the semester that these might be things that are applicable, and some of them should be you can probably incorporate them throughout. And then the last section is about like things that I've done in the actual Zoom classroom that have been helpful for me in kind of organizing that space towards community building. So first thing that I really struggled with, but has so far been helpful, is to just do less, specifically assigning less reading. So this looks different in my two different kinds of courses, like I mentioned. So in my literary theory class, I recalibrated my syllabus so that the readings are still there, like the entire kind of array of things that I hope that my students will read are still on the syllabus. So if I have somebody who is really motivated and they really want to read everything that Freud has ever said about psychoanalysis, like they really can. But I have focused but taking into consideration the fact that students themselves have less energy to do the reading and then to come to class and talk about it, we have decided as a class which reading we will focus on. So if it's that both texts are more or less of equal importance, I created a poll on Zoom, and then I give them the option to just kind of choose which one they would rather read. And also if it's an issue of like, it's Freud and someone else and they really need to know the Freud, then I'll say that they need to focus on this one reading. And this seems to be a really kind of basic suggestion, and it is a basic suggestion, but like I said, I found that with letting go of my anxiety about coverage and really thinking about like what are the really basic things that students do need to know, rather than my fantasy that I'm going to be able to cover the entire canon of literary theory or whatever, it means that they're able to focus more on the text itself, and also that there has been more focused discussion in class, because I also feel like my attention is not scattered in the sense that I'm trying to kind of manage multiple texts. So again, like this small thing seems not on the surface to be much about community building, but I'm finding that if I give less reading, or if I am less responsible to tasks or assignments, that means that I can shift other energies towards students connecting with each other outside of class, or doing things on message boards and so forth, which can, I believe, kind of create opportunities for connection. So I think of this as like if there's less pressure on the readings, then there's more openings for possibility both in the classroom, and also for them to do different sorts of things that might be conducive to building community in the classroom. So the other thing that I've done is creating like what I'm calling durable small groups. And I've done this in all of my classes, and I can talk a little bit later about how it looks in using the one piece of technology that I'm going to recommend, which is Perusall, versus other kinds of like discussion groups in my literature classes, if that's of help to anyone. But I actually just created these small groups, and because now I get a sense of like, a little bit about student personalities. But the idea behind this is that these are going to serve as their kind of mini cohorts for the entirety of the semester. So these small groups are going to be their sort of home base for presentations, paper workshops, collaborative reading annotation. And then that kind of smaller community that they're building there can translate, and I believe already has translated, to them feeling more comfortable and connected with this small group, and then therefore to the larger group. So then, and I feel like I'm kind of like running through this pretty quickly. So again, please feel free to stop me. So the biggest challenge for me, besides giving large or cutting back on the amount of reading that I was giving, was giving up the synchronous class meetings. So I have created a system that I think is going to work. Again, like, who knows, which I'll talk about in a second, to kind of split the difference between synchronous and asynchronous classes, because I was really concerned that students would feel unsupported. I was concerned that they wouldn't understand things if I wasn't there to explain things to them. But before I talk about those specific things with the small groups and those concerns with synchronous and asynchronous, I want to talk for a minute about this technology, or this app or website, Perusall. So I'm using this for my literary theory class, and one of the things that I didn't like about my class anyway, before now, is that in that class I spent a lot of time lecturing and explaining, even in person. And so my fantasy was that I would be able to give students opportunities to like kind of figure out what their big questions were before the class started. And I didn't know how to do that. So I was actually talking with our instructional designer, Nora Scully, and she recommended Perusall, which essentially lets you upload readings in PDF to the site. Students can either be assigned to smaller groups, which I've used my durable small groups for, and I've given them a very small page range that they're responsible for annotating, which means for this purpose, they have to read the entire reading, but they are responsible for like explaining key concepts on, say, 2 to 3 pages of dense reading. And then if any other student outside of their group comes in and they have a question, then the group whose page range it is then responsible for either saying, well, this is how I read it, or being like, I don't know, this is a great question to bring to class. So what happens is that they are actually able to talk with each other a bit more and kind of brainstorm some solutions, actually have shared knowledge. So, and then bring those things to class. So I did this for the first time today. It was our first Perusall reading. There were a few hiccups, but for the most part, when I looked back through what students were saying in those annotations, and I can like upvote a comment if I think it's really good, or I can say, actually, I think what the concept is doing here is a bit different. Like, why don't you look back on a prior page? I was really surprised to see, and this is probably my own, maybe I shouldn't be surprised, that students were actually able to explain, for the most part, like, or either how they thought that what the passage was describing in a very useful or almost correct way, and I had much less explication than I had to do. Or they were able to identify what the concepts were and what they didn't understand. So anyway, Perusall, I definitely recommend if you're assigning readings, because that does enable them to feel as though they're not just sitting in their rooms by themselves trying to puzzle something out, but they are actually able to go onto the website and say, I don't know what this is. I don't know what this is, or I do know what this is, and really feel like they're, contributing to the learning of others before the class even begins. So it's enabling them to feel connected. It's enabling them to feel a sense of responsibility. So I'm happy to talk more about that. The other thing, whoops. So yeah, Zoom fatigue. So what I have done is, in all of my classes, is I've made every Thursday, and it's always the same day of the week because I think it diminishes confusion for everyone, an optional synchronous day. And so the way I've set this up is that so ideally what will happen is that students will meet with their durable small groups that day. And I've given them different names based on the class. Like I'm teaching like a kind of hippie poetry class, and those small groups are called communes because I have a fantasy of living in a commune, which will never come to pass. So, and the other ones are like brainstorm groups or whatever. So the ideal for how the optional synchronous day will go is that students will decide when they meet with one another that day according to their schedules and their desires. They can talk about the readings and anything else that, projects or workshop papers or whatever. But if any member of a small group or the entire group decides that they're struggling with a concept or whatever, then they can come to the meeting, which is regular class time. And the only stipulation is that they need to come at the beginning of the normally scheduled class, so that we're not having people kind of drop in when when something has already been explained. But if a student only wants to stay for 10 minutes, that's absolutely fine. They can go. And I had my first optional synchronous day last Thursday with my class. And what I found is that some students decided just to meet with their small groups. And I had a smaller large group. And because it was optional, even though we ended up talking about the texts, students, it seemed, were like more comfortable because they had chosen to be there. They didn't have to be there, being like, like, I was really thinking about this thing, about this concept in the reading, and we didn't talk about it in the last class, but I was really thinking about, like, I didn't really understand this thing. So it was, and again, maybe it was because I was more relaxed too. They were like both talking about the concepts, and they felt, somebody was like, I want to see everyone's bookshelf. Like, what's on your bookshelf, Professor Decker? And so like we were showing each other. So it was this kind of really lovely, for me, like admixture of talking about what was yet to be explained or yet to be understood with the actual course content, and because they knew that they could leave whenever they wanted, and there wasn't any like mandate on my side of things that we had to cover something, that they felt a little bit, they were able to like connect with each other as human beings. Plus, they are able then to talk in their communes or their small groups or whatever about whatever they want to kind of like hash out outside of the large group. So I have high hopes for that. I also am like, well, this is actually kind of nice as a structure. Maybe I'll do it when we come back in person. But I'm finding more and more that the more I let go of either feeling like overly responsible for making sure that they're doing the work, the more that they want to learn, so they're showing up and they're doing the work anyway, and it seems to be more enjoyable for everyone. So yeah, so this is my outcome slide. This is me attempting to be a scientist with my outcomes. I don't know how successful that is. So here are just some really basic ideas, and this is my last kind of section. So really happy to hear your thoughts after this portion for in-class community building. So some people are already doing this. I notice, again, like these are really basic recommendations. So how to make Zoom less awful. Having students rename themselves with their pronouns. I actually am like, this is kind of great because then I don't accidentally misgender a student. It's actually there with their preferred name and their pronouns. Making sure that if students want to, they can turn their video on. Obviously that helps us feel more connected to one another if the video is on, but understanding that not everybody wants to show what their room looks like, or they have a really noisy, cacophonous space that they're in and they can't participate. This is actually kind of transformative for my class. I have been taking myself out of leading class discussion, and what I typically do is I'll put them in breakout rooms for like I'll give them time at the beginning to kind of gather their thoughts, maybe free write a few things that they want to that they know that they have questions about or they want to say, put them in breakout rooms to share for maybe 5 to 7 minutes, and then come back and say, okay, this is the main question that, I asked you to discuss, but I'm really eager to, and these are my few thoughts about it, really eager to hear what you have to say. I'm going to step back. Please open the participants panel. The only thing I'm going to do is I will say who's up next. And then if I have something really burning to say, I will drop it in the chat to everyone. And also I encourage the students who are shy to really use the chat function. It can be a lot to manage, which I admit, is like, oh, you have the chat, you have breakout, all people are speaking. How can you make sure that you're kind of ready to synthesize everything? But I have found, like, once again, that because they're using the hand raising function in Zoom rather than just like throwing their hands up this way, it gives people time, especially if there's a cue, to gather their thoughts. And because they have multiple ways to participate, it actually is enabling students who in classes I've had with them before, who are much slower to speak, to feel like they have a way to express actually in real time what they're thinking. So the last thing is, I guess I didn't. Oh yeah, here it is. Using the breakout rooms. My anxiety about the breakout rooms when I was teaching this summer was like, oh my God, I can't tell if they're done talking. I can't hear like the hum of the room to know whether they're talking about the texts at all. How long is too long? What should I do? I'm looking at myself, they're all gone. I feel really lonely. So I had to let go of like, also what I was doing then was like kind of like dropping in virtually to different rooms, being, oh yeah, I'm still here. Like, how's it all going? Because that was my way of like circulating through the room like I used to. It was very disruptive and very awkward. So I kind of gave up on that thing of like the drop in because it's very abrupt and nobody can see you coming and nobody wants you there anyway. Maybe it's just me, but I just put a discrete time limit and then I'll broadcast a message and be like 2 minutes left or whatever, and then call them all back. And I haven't done this yet, the kind of building up to longer breakout sessions or let them leave early, except in my asynchronous or my synchronous, optional synchronous day. But I think that that's possible if you really want to kind of build in multiple small group times, that it's possible that if you give them guidance, that it could be just fine to, my ideal is like 5 to 7 minutes. But it usually gets enough kind of generating that they're able to then share back with a large group. And there is that, feeling of actual discussion. So this is a question that I'm asking myself, like, okay, let's say you have this thing that you're putting in place, like how do you actually maintain it? And will it last throughout the entire semester? And my feeling is that, well, first of all, like, I don't know, but I'm planning this week to do just like send a Google form, like a little survey of like checking in with people about how it's going in their small group, because maybe there's some terrible dynamic in these small groups that I've created and they don't know how to tell me. And then I can rearrange them if it isn't going well. So I'm going to utilize surveys like maybe once every 2 weeks. And I think also, I feel like when the real fatigue sets in for the rest of the semester, like maybe I will, rather than doubling down and having them, post more, because that's weirdly my impulse. I'm like, oh, they're like, participation is diminishing. Do more things to participate. I feel like what I'm going to try to do is be like, well, maybe they need fewer synchronous meetings. Maybe all of them should be optional and there should be more asynchronous meetings.